Hi class. Alright, back to having some videos here. You're probably going through that big reading, and as I said in the update, it's a big reading, but it's big also so we can have the contrast of different eras of philosophy when they talk about the same issues to get through our timeline a bit quicker, just since I know a lot of you want to go deep on 20th century thinkers and certain topics that are even now just developing, and certain things that in the past eras are there, but not the prime focus. So hopefully the approach we're doing here works. Today, going to give you the cliff notes on David Hume for the contrast with cliff notes of Aristotle, and hopefully quicker summaries might make it more understandable in case you're having a more challenging time to digest the reading, even though most people seem to find it straightforward enough. Starting with cliff notes of David Hume. All right, David Hume basically says that what we think cause and effect are, those are actually just something called constant conjunction. That what we call cause and effect is really just an input that we're calling cause and an output or a consequence that we're calling effect, and they happen to always happen at the right time in linear sequenced time, and that we have no way of proving that the cause and effect we're seeing has always been the case before we were born, and we have no way of proving that in the future it will not change. So he is very big on future hypothetical and past hypothetical undermining a sense of causality. And that with constant conjunction, the most that is being seen with the system the Enlightenment thinkers had of you either have a direct impression or you have an idea about your direct impression, your perception. Within that system, constant conjunction is the patterns we see that have been constant enough for us in our life that it's practical and convenient for all of us to just go with it and say it's cause and effect and not worry about things he points out. You know, things with logic and math and numbers, which for a lot of the ancients were universals. For Plato, they were forms. Later on, we'll see with Arabic philosophers, they were secondary concepts, you know, related to reality, but somewhat separate from reality. For Hume, following the steps of Descartes, having a big separation with no real bridge between mind and matter, Hume says that all is true, but you can only demonstrate it in terms of math, and only math can really instantiate it. Outside of that, math itself, he says, does not have any real world physical instantiation. Okay, and that's, some people with modern observations might have questions about that. It is interesting later on to compare Aristotle's take on reality and David Hume's and see which one survives the last 100 years of scientific observations better. But that's what Hume said, and he also said that we have in our mind the ability to find patterns, and we use patterns for the sake of survival, for the sake of convenience, and for the sake of prosperity. Okay, but that the patterns don't actually exist in the world. He kind of mixed Descartes with mind-matter separation, and Isaac Newton with the conception from some physics observations of matter being balls, little balls bouncing off each other constantly. And that's sort of seeing reality as starting with many and with flux rather than with a single and simple starting point. He put those together to get his epistemology and ontology of a chaotic world, unpredictable world, in some ways unknowable world, but that the social dimension we have as humans sees us make patterns. And I point out in the reading, some people point out that's a logical inconsistency, that patterns and survival and practicality and prosperity, those are causes, with the effect being what we're experiencing. So he's kind of, some people argue that he's renaming cause and effect when it suits him. And then every other situation, oh, there's no cause and effect. To be fair to him, though, there's evidence that in his conversations with people, since he was a public philosopher who loved going to the pub, to the restaurant, talking to average people about philosophy when he was not working in his profession. And there's a lot of evidence that he pointed out that there was an inconsistency in his own approach, and that he might have been more about using his skeptical method as what he called a healthy dose or a good shot of skepticism that everyone should consider or contemplate, just to prevent problems he saw in his own life in the early 18th century of dogmatic thinking in claims that could not be perfectly justified, having a negative effect. All sorts of social and cultural conflicts from dogmatic thinking. He said, I'm laying out some skeptical methods to prevent that, but I don't think my own skeptical methods could become the final truth. So it's not totally clear if he was proposing his own epistemology and ontology to be something final, even though other subsequent people did take it as like a final truth. Okay? And one thing worth noting is that the reaction to Hume from Immanuel Kant, when he said that mental concepts do have reality, but they're so real that we should actually make everything follow the mental concepts. Kant was being different from Plato in that he doesn't think the mental concepts have any reality in the world. He accepts a Hume enlightenment premise, but he says that the concepts being repeating across every human have their own level of reality, and that people should follow them anyway. That's where he gets the categorical imperative. That's something we'll talk more about when we go to ethics. The idea of things that you must do no matter what was something Kant talked about with his ethics. And then some people argue pretty persuasively that Hegel and all of his descendants, when it comes to Marx and Nietzsche and certain other thinkers like of the 19th and 20th centuries who follow Hegel, follow Kant with, okay, mind, matter, they are separate, they can't touch each other, but what's in the mind has so much goodness that you should follow it no matter what. People think that separation of reality and resulting need for reality to be made into conformity with the mind is where you get ideology from. And ideology, we'll talk about more in political philosophy, is separate from philosophy or from religion. And one of the separating traits of ideology is the demand for human action to bring the world around you into conformity with an abstract ideal in your mind, okay, or in the mind. And it's usually hypersystematic. Okay, so hypersystematic and forcing through action are things that make ideology separate from philosophy, which you could apply as, which you could argue is seeking principles that you can dynamically apply, and religion, which you could argue is trying to find ritual and repetition to deeper matters of truth. Okay, there's all sorts of ways you can define philosophy and religion, but we'll get into that later in political philosophy, an argument that I'm going to give you, and you can disagree if you want, but the argument is there's good philosophy and bad philosophy, and there's good religion and bad religion, but that there's no such thing as good ideology. That ideology always leads to a negative. Okay? Big on how you define the terms, and also then how you observe history, but we'll talk about that later. Okay, so with constant conjunction from David Hume, it's big on time and hypotheticals undermining any concept of permanent universals and permanent truth. Okay, how does Aristotle respond? Here's the cliff notes for Aristotle. Okay, he was responding to those arguments when they were being made, as I point out, from atomists, hedonists, skeptics, cynics, different schools where we're going to go into what they say more about how to live a good life, but they did have things to say about nature of reality, and they all pretty much align with the Enlightenment skeptical approach, which is why I make that connection in the reading to cover more ground. If you want to check for yourself, just look up any of those schools on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Really good resource online. I think you'll see what I mean with how The Enlightenment thinkers, particularly Anglo-Scottish and particularly Hume, synthesize a bunch of ancient traditions. The atomists, the hedonists, the skeptics, the cynics. Okay? If you think there's a major difference, great, bring it into discussions and assignments, point out the difference, and we'll talk about it. Aristotle is contending with the arguments that I just kind of gave to you, and he's also contending with the fact that he and several other people, they like Plato's forms, but the idea that forms are totally separate and that they're unchanging causes problems about why is there so much change in the world we see. How do you account for change if the forms are totally separate and totally unchanging? He says that forms do not change, but matter does change, and what explains the change in matter from one form to another is that forms, when they become real, they become an essence, which is the unique identity, union of form and matter so strong that it's more than simple synthesis. It's a unique union that we call essence, and it's hylomorphic, which means form, matter together, they are one. Even though you see some separate components interacting, there's still a unity and a oneness to everything that you encounter. Okay? And with that, you have potency or potentia or potential, okay, being matter itself, and he was into prime matter and simple matter starting, having the potential to go in any direction to become any actual manifestation. And that's where actia, actual, and act come from. Actual is our modern world, our modern word, which gets at the ancient understanding of act, which is to be real. When we think of action and activity, we think of external motion and external processes, whereas act itself, when you read anyone in philosophy who's talking about act or pure act, being simplest being, that is being real. Just if something's real and it's perceivable and it has a whole to it, then it has act. Later on, other schools use the word quiddity to mean being real. Today, we say being real in the English language. All right, so all matter, he said, has potency, okay, but to be brought into act, to be brought into something unique and whole, something has to be working on the matter. And he said that change itself has universals to it. Okay, so those universals of change are the four causes that we have in the reading. He says everything you ever experience has a material cause, the actual physical elements composing it. It has a formal cause, which is the unique essence distinguished from everything else. How do you know it is what it is? Well, it's the identity, and he calls it formal cause, is the identity of a thing in the present moment. Agent cause is the force, be it personal, be it mechanical, be it natural, the force working on the matter to bring it into its final act. And then final cause is the big thing of Aristotle, the idea that everything has a purpose within a broader whole, within a broader being, there is purpose. And the purpose of anything you observe is the final cause. And then there's debate that we get into in the reading about purpose in purely natural phenomena. Some read it as being the purpose of fullness of life that things tend towards and then fall away from in the process of death, and the purpose of contributing to a broader ecosystem is what some people think the natural consequence of that is. And yet Aristotle would have that in parallel with human purposes being just as important as natural purposes, and then he moves to final purposes for all of existence. Okay, so potency and act with the four causes are Aristotle saying that you do not need time to have cause and effect. For something to exist rather than nothing, and for the particular form of anything that exists to be its particular form, you have causes without which you would not have being, without which you would not have the particular being. And the causes are in the present moment. They don't need past and future. They don't need input, output. He still thought the universe had time in it, and that's where Augustine And some medieval thinkers really differ. They think time is totally separate from the universe, and then a lot of people go that way because of Albert Einstein's theory of relativity in the last 100 years, kind of giving more proof for time as a separate thing from space. But regardless of how time connects to reality, which is a future topic we'll go to, in the present moment, whatever you think about time, a present moment with no sense of before and after has causes. And Aristotle would challenge you to think of anything that doesn't have the four causes, and to think of anything when it comes to change that is not simply potential latent property becoming actual manifested property. From potential and act and from the four causes, Aristotle gives his argument for a first mover. And so, as I said, his earlier arguments, to compare that with what Hume was all about, with constant conjunction, and with what different skeptical schools say about causality, to really know what you think, you need to kind of go deeper into time, and what is time, and how does time relate to reality. That's one thing we'll come back to later. The other is infinity, because from the four causes and from potential and act, Aristotle argued that everything you ever encounter is caused by something else and is contingent on other things for its existence, and that in this world of prior cause and prior contingency for being, there has to be a single starting point. He's big on single and simple starting point, not many and fluctual. It's a single, simple starting point. He argues that because of the concept of infinite regress being a logical fallacy, or just not real when it's actually explained more deeply. So infinite regress is one of three options for causes of what we see, or at least nature of what we see, if we're not sold on causality yet. What we have with infinite regress is the idea of regress itself. How do you prove that a starting point is a starting point? There's basically three takes. There's single starting point needed for anything else to exist, and that starting point would have no beginning, no end. It would just be being as being. That's a single starting point. There's contingent chain idea, that you have a handful of things codependent on each other, and they are at least a single starting point of reality, but there's no singleness because there's more than one, and it's finite. Okay? Then you have this idea of endless number of causes. And the argument against that is that, what do you mean by endless? That's why I say, we'll come back to a future lesson about infinity. What is infinity? What is endless? If you just mean more than you can count, all you've done is moved a potential final starting point away from your counting ability. You kind of say, might as well not think about it, it's probably endless, and then you switch the conversation. Okay? If it's endless in terms of you think it's possible for one scenario to be changing into a new scenario, and for that process to go backwards without limit, like actual infinity being without limit. If there is no limit, then the thing that actually connects the first scenario, not even the first scenario, any scenario being connected to any other scenario, the connection of change between those scenarios that's being held as part of an endless chain, well, that connection, if it's actually endless, then that connection has some sort of infinite and singular quality that you can track between every situation. And again, you've kind of rearranged terms, but you still have something singular and limitless for the whole endless chain to even make sense to begin with. Because the alternatives to that are the endless chain at some point did not exist, which means nothing exists from the whole ex nihil fit principle of something from something, nothing from nothing. Or if there's no connection between scenarios and you have an endless number of universes or worlds of existence or totalities of existence, they're endless but not connected, well, how do you know that there's more than the one that you're even in if they're not connected? Some people think that there is a potential with matter itself having infinite, endless potential, following potential and actual, and that the infinite matter could be some many starting point, but it doesn't mean that that anything that you encounter does not have finite beginnings and endings. It's kind of, again, sort of taking prime matter and calling it your infinite starting point. It seems that anything that has logical consistency has a starting point that is infinite. It could be an eternal universe with co-contingent causes, could be eternal infinite matter, or it could be a singularity that is separate from time and space working on it. Okay? Those are the modern understandings. What's interesting about Aristotle saying that there needs to be a single starting point, that the single starting point gives being to everything else, and everything comes back to the single starting point, is that he put that starting point singular, but in the universe. He had eternal universe, but he also thought there was an intelligence to the singular, eternal starting point of a universe. And he understood it to be something like what we call God, which is different from the three common ones today are conventional, traditional religious faith, that the single starting point is outside of time and space and acting on it, or that your material starting point, whether it's many in matter or a handful of forces, could be energy, gravity, matter, friction, finite set. People tend to view those two options as being inanimate. And then if you're into anything that has intelligence to it, then you must be in the religious direction. Aristotle is saying, no, single starting point, but it's in the universe. And it's intelligent. Okay, so he is very unique. And his logic to get there is logic that is still used in all the subsequent schools of logic, even by tons of people who are into those other viewpoints that I just laid out. Which is impressive, that his logic and his method is still being used. Some of you are into Martha Nussbaum. She has a really good interview from the 80s that you can find on YouTube where she points out how he really considered himself to be the first scientist and he was using a scientific method. And then there's Dr. Darren Staloff, friends with the guy who I already mentioned, Dr. Michael Subaru. Staloff has a really good summary in 1 hour of the schema and the metaphysics that our reading and the last few minutes of this talk have been laying out. Okay, so hopefully I've summarized Hume sufficiently. He says there is no cause and effect. There's just patterns that we make in our mind because they're useful, and there's a total separation between the mind and the world. And he kind of stops there and just says, think about it. Don't become a dogmatic jerk and move on with life. He thinks there's still, in the patterns, there's useful things, and we should not, attack religion, for example. He said that there should be religion in public life, but that no one should go too far, whether it's a religious worldview, a philosophy of any sort, or a secular ideology. He just said, don't go too far with anything. And that's the positive side of Hume, is that Hume really is one of the people bringing about tolerant pluralism in public life, and it's kind of spread to many parts of the world, and that's a positive thing. We're not sure how seriously he took his own methods, but his methods were big, separation between mind and matter, patterns just being in the mind, the world being chaotic flux of multiple items, countless possibly items of matter. And then from that you get idealists like Kant and all of his successors, and then realists who either go into absurdism because they accept the idea of a chaotic matter-based world, or they get into different approaches of trying to find what's objective in material existence, trying to find some universal in material existence, maybe on a somewhat similar track to Aristotle. Then you have Aristotle saying, regardless of time, anything you ever encounter has four causes. The four causes explain changes from potential to actual, and that any actual being had latent traits in an earlier state of being brought to actuality by forces moving upon it, that these forces and states of being that they move between have a chain going to a single starting point, which is an intelligent, eternal, perfect being known as God, and all realities extending from the being of the first being, and then in its own course coming back to the first being. Regardless of infinity and time and how those things play in, to this battle between a bunch of schools kind of summarized by Aristotle and a bunch of schools summarized by Hume, regardless of infinity and time, which we'll come back to later. You have the nature of experience in the present moment having four causes, explaining the change in matter between different forms. And for a lot of people, that's sufficient. Close the book, move on with your life. You can trust your senses, you can trust ordinary life and the patterns that ordinary life reveals to you in your own search for happiness. Okay, and hopefully I've shown how with Hume, you at least get pluralism and desire for rational thinking, to double check every proposition, and to embrace different beliefs. And hopefully from Aristotle, you see that there are some laws of logic that are universal that can help us find a universal connection and at least have something outside of our own whims and outside of our own passions and desires to reason out what is most important and what should be governing our actions, our behavior, our relationships. We at least have a starting point for universal ethics. It's almost like Aristotle with the logic and Hume with second-guessing dogmatic claims. If you put them together, you have some great material for a free society that can have an ongoing conversation about universal truth. Not saying that there's no such thing as universal truth, but not saying that a universal truth is so complete and final that some group of people who possesses it gets to force other people in positive behavior. Kind of finding the idea of a dynamic concept of truth where truth is outside of yourself. It is objective, but it's also infinite and dynamic. That's kind of the awesome synthesis that if you want to kind of put Aristotle and Hume together, arguably a lot of the medieval thinkers accomplished that, and that's why there's a number of schools in the last 100 years who still have value for the medieval thinkers, even though their culture was totally different and their terms of thought were totally different. The idea of truth being outside of you and objective, but also infinite and self-revealing. And if there is any personality to it, then it's a loving, positive personality. Those are some really good things that come out of this process of metaphysics and ontology and epistemology to find common starting points to reality between people that we can all understand and that have some bearing in reality, revealing it. All right, so hopefully that's helped you guys get some of the differences, okay? And hopefully you see the connection really, like one thing to remember could be that Aristotle, with a simple and single starting point, develops a system of logic to explain change. Hume, with a manifold, complicated, fluctuating starting point, says that change is just a helpful pattern in the mind. Those are two big things that we can build upon. And as I say, if you want to come closer to some sort of working best guess, it'll be after we turn over from the next unit, which is more about how to live a good life. So for the people who don't like the metaphysics talk, they tend to love the psychological side and the relationship side and how to have a good life. Once we've gone through that, we'll go back to just time and free will and infinity. Those things will be after the next unit, and they are kind of relevant to both nature of reality and how you have a good life and how you have good relationships. And then beyond that, advanced ethics, and then some political philosophy, and then, a bunch of time at the end of the course to talk about the schools that you guys already have some interest in from previous studies. Basically a lot of 20th century stuff. We'll compare 20th century stuff to each other and to some topics that we've been developing in the threads and to previous philosophy. All right, have a good one.